Under a heavy sky, Windsor Castle stood like an unyielding guardian of history, its ancient stones steeped in the weight of centuries. The wind whispered through the manicured lawns, carrying with it the ghosts of 1,000 ceremonies, private conversations, and guarded secrets. For generations, the British monarchy had mastered the art of quiet power, never showing too much, never losing its grip on tradition. But on this particular day, the calm had been shattered. Inside the grand halls, behind closed doors, a storm had erupted. Not the kind nature brings, but one born from words, ambition, and a claim so audacious it sent shockwaves through the royal household. At the heart of this unfolding drama was not a political coup or a foreign scandal, but a single, disputed piece of property. Not just any property, but one intimately tied to the late Queen Elizabeth II, a place and collection that carried her scent, her touch, her stories. These were not mere walls and gardens. They were woven into the very fabric of her reign. From state dinners to private family moments, they had been silent witnesses to the sovereign's life. And now, in a move that many in the palace described as unthinkable, Meghan Markle had allegedly laid claim to it. Not for the nation, not even for herself directly, but for her own family's use. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The claim did not arrive with a public announcement at first. No, it was whispered in legal corridors, hinted at in private conversations, and eventually found its way into the eager ears of the British press. For those inside the monarchy, it was a direct challenge to the invisible yet unbreakable rules of royal succession and inheritance. The Queen's legacy was not just about titles and jewels. It was about preserving the dignity of the crown, about ensuring that certain things remained untouched, sacrosanct. And yet here was a request, some would say a demand, that seemed to slice through all that tradition like a hot knife through soft wax. To understand the weight of this moment, one must grasp the deep emotional connection the late Queen had with her possessions. She was not a ruler who saw her treasures as trophies. They were reminders of service, of history, of promises made and kept. Some items had been passed down through centuries. Others were personal mementos from her father, King George VI, or from her early days with Prince Philip. The property Meghan allegedly sought was said to be more than just a residence. It was a sanctuary, a place where the Queen had retreated to think, to heal, and to draw strength. For Meghan to claim it for her own family was, to many within the royal circle, like walking into someone's private diary and tearing out the most intimate pages. In the early stages, palace insiders tried to keep the matter contained. Discussions were held in the Queen's private study, now the King's, where heavy drapes muffled heated voices. King Charles III, still navigating the weight of the crown he had inherited far later in life than he ever expected, was faced with a decision that could define not just his reign, but his relationship with his son and daughter-in-law forever. For years, Charles had been accused of being too cautious, too willing to preserve appearances at the expense of firm action. This time, however, the stakes were different. This was not just a question of public image. It was a matter of respect for his mother's memory. As news of Meghan's alleged claim began to leak, the tabloids seized on it like wolves scenting fresh prey. Headlines screamed with barely restrained outrage, framing the Duchess as entitled, ungrateful, and out of touch. Across Britain, in pubs and living rooms, the conversation became heated. Was Meghan within her rights as a royal by marriage to make such a claim? Or was this yet another example of her crossing a line that should never be approached? Even those who had once defended her found themselves struggling to reconcile the request with the traditions they had been taught to value. The property in question was, in many ways, a symbol of the monarchy itself, rooted in history, bound by duty, and not easily severed from the crown. Harry's role in all of this added another layer of complexity. For a man who had walked away from royal duties in the name of personal freedom and protection for his family, his silence in the face of this controversy was deafening. Was he quietly supporting his wife's claim behind the scenes? Or was he, as some sources suggested, conflicted, torn between the woman he loved and the family legacy he had grown up defending? Royal aides, speaking off the record, hinted that Harry had been seen in tense conversations with both his father and brother, his voice raised, his gestures sharp. The image of the once close royal trio, Charles, William, and Harry, now fractured beyond recognition, was a poignant reminder of how quickly familial bonds can fray under the strain of public life. For King Charles, the issue was not just about ownership, but about precedent. If this claim was allowed to stand, what message would it send? Could other royal assets, tied to the crown's legacy, be subject to personal appropriation by those who married into the family? It was a slippery slope, and one he was determined not to slide down. In private, his advisors urged firmness. Publicly, he maintained the same measured composure his mother had perfected over decades. But those who knew him well said the decision was already forming in his mind, a decision that would be as much about protecting the monarchy as it would be about drawing a line in the sand with Meghan and Harry. By the time the first official whispers of a royal response began to surface, the narrative had already grown teeth. Meghan was portrayed in some quarters as a calculating opportunist, in others as a misunderstood woman simply trying to secure a future for her children. Social media became a battlefield of opinions, each post either sharpening the dagger or holding out an olive branch. Hashtags trended. Commentators dissected every expression, every gesture from recent public appearances. The monarchy, once again, found itself at the center of a cultural debate about privilege, modernity, and the limits of tradition. And yet, beneath all the noise, the heart of the story remained deeply personal. This was not simply about a duchess and a king. It was about a son and his father, about a widow's memory and a nation's sense of heritage. It was about the invisible threads that tie people to places and how easily those threads can be strained to the point of snapping. The decision King Charles was about to make would not just answer the question of property ownership. It would speak volumes about where the monarchy stood in the 21st century and who it was willing to protect. As the day of reckoning approached, courtiers noted a change in Charles's demeanor. His steps were more deliberate, his eyes less inclined to soften. This was not the hesitant air of old. This was a king ready to act. When the final decision came, it would not be wrapped in poetic language or softened by diplomatic phrases. It would be clear, firm, and impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. A declaration that certain lines cannot be crossed, not even by family. The events that followed would shake the royal household to its core, igniting debates that stretched far beyond the gates of the palace. And while the property itself remained immovable, the people connected to it would find their lives changed forever. For Meghan, the move would mark yet another chapter in a tumultuous journey with the monarchy. For Harry, it would deepen the rift that time alone could not heal. And for King Charles, it would stand as a defining moment, a test of his ability to honor his mother's memory while steering the monarchy through the turbulent waters of modern scandal. This is where our story begins, not with a resolution, but with a question. How far should one go to protect a legacy? And what happens when love, ambition, and tradition collide in the most public of arenas? The answers, as you will see, are rarely simple, but they are unforgettable. The Queen's hidden legacy was not something that could be measured in market value or cataloged like a simple asset. It was a living, breathing testament to the life of a monarch who had served her country with a consistency that spanned generations. To understand the magnitude of the property at the center of the dispute, you must picture it as more than an estate. Imagine a place where the walls seemed to hum with stories, where the floors had been worn smooth by the quiet footsteps of a queen who had walked there in moments of joy, grief, and contemplation. The scent of polished wood and fresh-cut flowers still lingered in its halls, as if refusing to yield to the inevitability of time. This particular estate had long been seen as an intimate refuge, far from the ceremonial demands of Buckingham Palace and the political pulse of Windsor Castle. It was here that the Queen had retreated after some of the most difficult chapters of her life, moments that could never be broadcast to the public but were quietly endured in the privacy of these grounds. The gardens were meticulously maintained, each section reflecting a part of her personal taste. The walled rose garden inspired by her grandmother's own designs, the sweeping lawns where her beloved corgis once ran freely, and the glass conservatory where she kept rare orchids gifted by foreign dignitaries. The buildings themselves were an architectural dialogue between eras. Portions dated back hundreds of years, with original stonework and timber beams still in place, bearing the marks of craftsmen long gone. Later additions were more modern but carried the Queen's understated elegance, never ostentatious, but always purposeful. This was not just a home. It was a sanctuary where the monarch could be Elizabeth, the woman, without the endless scrutiny of her title. Royal historians often spoke of this property as the beating heart of the crown's private life. It wasn't where treaties were signed or state dinners held. It was where the monarch's humanity could breathe. Every family gathering that took place there, birthdays, christenings, quiet Christmas mornings, added another invisible thread to its legacy. Photographs that never made it into the press captured the Queen at her most relaxed, laughing with her children by the fireplace, walking hand in hand with Prince Philip along the orchard path, or feeding the swans at the private lake. And yet, for all its warmth and charm, the property held a kind of unspoken rule. It was never to be claimed by any one member of the family for exclusive ownership. Its preservation depended on its connection to the crown as an institution, not as a personal prize. The Queen had been meticulous about ensuring that this understanding was passed down, not through legal jargon alone, but through lived example. She had once reportedly said to a close aide, "These places belong to history, not to us. We are only their caretakers." That sentiment was the thread that bound the estate to the monarchy's identity. After her passing, there had been no immediate public discussion about the property's fate. It was assumed, as with so many royal assets, that it would remain available for official use or as a retreat for future monarchs. But in the weeks that followed, the quiet corridors of the palace began to stir with whispers. These whispers claimed that Meghan Markle, through either a formal petition or private channels, had expressed a desire to secure the estate for her own family. The phrasing varied depending on the source. Some said she wanted it as a holiday home for Archie and Lilibet. Others claimed she wanted to turn part of it into a philanthropic retreat under her own name. Regardless of the exact intention, the idea struck at the core of the unwritten agreement that had safeguarded the property for generations. What made the situation more volatile was the estate's symbolic connection to the late Queen's personal life. This wasn't like asking for a suite at Kensington Palace or a lesser-known residence. This was a direct link to Elizabeth II's private legacy. Even within the royal family, few had stayed there for extended periods. It was a place reserved for the most trusted circle, and even then, only with the monarch's invitation. In exploring why Meghan might have wanted this property, one must consider the intricate intersection of personal ambition and royal protocol. Meghan, by her own account, had always sought independence within her role. The restrictions of royal life, what she could say, where she could go, how she could live, had been a source of constant tension. To possess a royal estate of this caliber, even unofficially, would grant a kind of autonomy she had rarely experienced within the family. It would be a place free from the reach of palace aides and press officers, yet still imbued with the prestige of the crown. In her mind, perhaps it was not so much a breach of protocol as it was a natural progression toward building a secure base for her family. But to King Charles and many within the institution, the request, if it was indeed framed as ownership, was a sharp deviation from the principles that held the monarchy together. The Queen's hidden legacy was not meant to be dissected into private holdings. It was part of the monarchy's collective identity, one of those rare assets that blurred the line between public heritage and private refuge. Allowing it to be claimed would risk unraveling that delicate balance, potentially inviting future disputes over other properties and treasures. The royal archives contain meticulous records about the estate's history. Some of these documents dated back to the reign of Queen Victoria, noting the property's acquisition and its intended use. Others detailed restorations commissioned by George VI, who saw it as a retreat for his young family during the tumultuous war years. Each entry reinforced the idea that the property was bound to the crown, not to the whims of individual family members. Legal scholars familiar with royal estates could point to precedents where similar claims had been denied, sometimes quietly, sometimes with public statements that reaffirmed the crown's custodial role. Within the family, the estate had an almost mythical status. Prince Philip had once called it the one place where the monarchy breathes. Princess Anne, in interviews, had referred to it fondly, describing afternoons spent riding horses through its meadows and evenings where the Queen would read aloud from her favorite novels. Even Prince William had taken Catherine there early in their courtship, in what friends said was his way of sharing the truest glimpse of his family life. It was, in every sense, a shared inheritance of memory and meaning, not something that could be signed over without consequences. This is why Meghan's alleged claim, whether intended as a request or a formal demand, cut so deeply. It wasn't merely about property rights. It was about the disruption of a living symbol, the severing of a tradition that connected the monarchy's past to its future. As the details of the claim became known within the palace, reactions varied. Some aides urged a diplomatic handling, perhaps offering Meghan a different property of equal comfort but lesser significance. Others argued that even entertaining the conversation risked undermining the sanctity of the estate's status. The Queen's hidden legacy, they insisted, could not become a bargaining chip in the delicate negotiations that had defined the Sussexes' relationship with the rest of the family. And yet, beneath the political and procedural arguments lay something far more personal. For King Charles, this property was a reminder of his mother's unwavering dedication, of the moments they had shared in its gardens discussing matters both public and private. To see it potentially removed from the monarchy's care was, in his eyes, not just an administrative issue, but an emotional loss. It became clear to those closest to him that this was a matter he would not approach with detachment. The stage was set for a confrontation, not in the public eye, but within the guarded confines of the royal institution. And as with so many royal disputes, what happened next would be shaped not only by legal precedent and tradition, but by the deeply human emotions of pride, grief, and the desire to protect what one holds most dear. It began, as so many royal controversies do, not with a grand announcement, but with a whisper. The initial murmurs about Meghan Markle's claim over the late Queen's cherished property surfaced in hushed tones among palace aides. These whispers spread in the quiet corridors where staff knew how to speak without being overheard, and where the weight of every word could change the mood of the entire household. What started as idle speculation quickly hardened into a persistent rumor, and soon, those closest to the crown understood they were standing on the brink of a serious internal conflict. According to several accounts from individuals familiar with the matter, the claim did not begin as an outright declaration of ownership. It allegedly emerged through a series of discreet communications, letters passed to royal legal advisors, inquiries framed as logistical questions, and subtle references in private conversations with those who still had influence inside the family. Meghan, now living a life across the Atlantic, knew that direct approaches could provoke immediate rejection. Instead, the effort seemed to be about establishing a foundation, a soft entry point into what would become a highly charged request. The message, however it was first delivered, was unmistakable. The Duchess of Sussex wanted the property not for official duties or as a temporary royal residence, but as a personal base for her own family. She envisioned, some sources suggested, a home where Archie and Lilibet could grow up with a connection to their heritage without the constant glare of the British press. On the surface, it was a reasonable idea, children with royal blood having access to a place tied to their great-grandmother. But beneath the surface lay a much thornier issue, the tradition that properties of this kind were never to be claimed for exclusive use by any one branch of the family. Inside the palace, this revelation sent ripples of unease through both senior courtiers and members of the family. The Queen's property was sacred ground in royal terms. It had not been built or maintained as a personal inheritance for individuals. It was part of the collective fabric of the monarchy. For Meghan to stake a claim on it was, in the eyes of many, not merely an overstep but a direct challenge to the system that had endured for centuries. And it was impossible to ignore the timing. Only months after the Queen's death, when emotions were still raw and the monarchy was adjusting to new leadership under King Charles. The request's delivery method also stirred quiet controversy. It was said to have been crafted with the same precision Meghan brought to her media appearances, well-worded, tactful, and framed in a way that appealed to compassion and family unity. She referenced the importance of heritage, the desire for her children to feel connected to their roots, and the symbolic value of maintaining a presence within the United Kingdom. But to the seasoned eyes of the palace legal team, This framing also carried legal undertones. It read less like a simple wish and more like an opening move in a negotiation. Once word reached King Charles, he reportedly reacted with a mixture of disbelief and resolve. Disbelief that the request was made at all, given the years of tension between the Sussexes and the rest of the family, and resolve that such a precedent could not be allowed to take root. Privately, Charles understood that this was not just about Meghan. If he allowed one family member to claim such a property outright, it would open the door for similar demands from others in the future. The stability of royal property arrangements rested on the principle of custodianship, not personal ownership. Prince William, for his part, was said to have been quietly furious. In his view, the property belonged to the legacy of their grandmother, and any attempt to remove it from the monarchy's care was nothing short of an insult to her memory. William had always been protective of certain royal traditions, especially those linked to the Queen, and he made his feelings clear in private conversations with his father. According to aides, his advice was blunt: stop this before it goes any further. Meanwhile, Harry found himself once again at the center of a tug-of-war between the woman he married and the family he was born into. Reports suggested he was involved in the early stages of the request, possibly helping to shape the language and tone in hopes of making it more palatable to the palace. Friends of the couple argued that Harry was simply trying to create a safe space for his children, a home base in the UK that would be theirs no matter the status of their royal roles. But to critics within the family, it was yet another sign that Harry had lost touch with the principles he once defended. When news of the claim leaked to the press, whether by accident or by design, it was as if a match had been struck in a dry field. The tabloids went into overdrive, each paper offering its own interpretation of Meghan's motives. Some painted her as a schemer seeking to strip the monarchy of its treasures. Others took a softer approach, framing her as a mother protecting her children's rights. The public response was predictably polarized. Social media became a battlefield of hashtags, with supporters rallying behind her and detractors condemning her alleged audacity. What made the situation more volatile was that, unlike many past royal disputes, this one had a physical, tangible symbol: the property itself. People could picture it, imagine its rooms, its gardens, its history. They could connect it to the images of the Queen they had grown up with. It wasn't an abstract legal matter. It was a real, living piece of the monarchy's identity. And the thought of it being taken away, even partially, by someone who had stepped away from royal duties was deeply unsettling to traditionalists. In the days following the leak, Palace communications staff worked tirelessly to craft a strategy. Should they ignore the reports, hoping the story would fade? Or should they address it head-on, risking a public spat that could further damage the monarchy's image? Senior advisors debated the potential fallout. One faction argued for quiet diplomacy, perhaps offering Meghan access to another property of equal comfort but lesser significance. Another insisted that any concession would be seen as weakness and encourage more demands in the future. For Meghan and Harry, the reaction from the UK media and public must have been a sobering reminder of just how fiercely guarded the Queen's memory remained. Their supporters pointed out that the monarchy was not above adapting traditions to meet the needs of a changing world. Why shouldn't the children of the Sussexes have a tangible link to their heritage? But those in the opposing camp argued that this was not about fairness. It was about preserving the monarchy's very structure. In their view, Meghan's claim undermined the idea that these properties were held for the benefit of the crown and the nation, not for the enrichment of individuals. As the days turned into weeks, the air inside the palace grew heavier. Courtiers spoke in clipped tones, avoiding speculation in public spaces. Meetings between Charles and his closest advisors became more frequent, often running late into the evening. By now, it was clear that this was not a matter that could be left unresolved. One way or another, the king would have to respond, and his response would carry implications far beyond the walls of the disputed estate. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the king's judgment, but the resilience of the monarchy itself. The property had become more than a house. It was a symbol of the Queen's reign, a relic of continuity in a time of rapid change, and a flashpoint in the ongoing saga between the Sussexes and the royal family. In the weeks that followed, every decision, every leaked memo, every sidelong glance between family members would be scrutinized for signs of what was to come. Harry's position in the storm was unlike anyone else's. He wasn't merely a spectator to the unfolding dispute between his wife and his father. He was the bridge, or at least he was supposed to be. But that bridge had been weathered by years of tension, stripped down by repeated storms, and now, with this property dispute, it was buckling under the strain. To understand the weight pressing down on him, one must remember that Harry had lived his entire life under the gaze of the monarchy, yet had also been the one to most dramatically step away from it. This meant that he understood both the rigid traditions that bound the royal family and the desire to break free from them. And now, those two worlds were colliding in the most personal way possible. In the earliest days of the claim, Harry was said to have been deeply involved in discussions about strategy. Friends close to the Sussexes revealed that he had spoken at length with Meghan about the symbolic and practical value of securing the Queen's property. For him, there was an emotional dimension that few could fully appreciate. This estate was not just part of his grandmother's legacy, it was part of his own childhood. He had memories of playing on its lawns with William, of watching the Queen feed her dogs by the kitchen door, of Christmas mornings when the family gathered in the sitting room before the public festivities began. In his eyes, it wasn't merely a possession. It was a place where, for fleeting moments, life had felt normal. But sentiment and reality were two very different forces in Harry's life. His understanding of royal protocol told him that claiming the property outright would be controversial. Yet his life in California, far removed from the palace's daily operations, had given him a different perspective on what was possible. If he could frame the request not as a personal grab, but as a way to ensure his children's connection to their heritage, perhaps it could be received more warmly. It was this thinking, sources suggest, that shaped his early involvement in the proposal Meghan eventually made. Inside the palace, however, there was skepticism about Harry's motives. Senior aides who had worked with him before his departure noted a change in his approach since stepping down from royal duties. They described a man more willing to challenge traditions, more determined to carve out space for himself outside the established hierarchy. Some believed that Meghan's claim was as much his idea as hers, even if she was the one voicing it. To them, it was another example of the couple operating as a unit against the grain of the monarchy. Harry's relationship with William, already strained by years of personal and public disagreements, did not improve during these weeks. William viewed the property as an untouchable part of their grandmother's legacy, and any attempt to claim it felt, in his mind, like crossing a line that should never be approached. In private conversations, he made his opposition known, not just to Charles, but to other senior family members who could influence the decision. Reports from those close to the brothers suggested that their interactions during this period were minimal and frosty, limited to brief exchanges at family gatherings where the tension was palpable. Between his father and his brother, Harry found himself cornered. King Charles, though careful to maintain a diplomatic tone in public, was firm in private. He reminded Harry that the monarchy's survival depended on the principle of custodianship, that no single member could treat royal property as personal inheritance unless explicitly willed by the reigning monarch. It wasn't a matter of denying Meghan or the children a connection to the UK, he explained, but of preserving the institution's integrity. For Charles, this was about more than one property. It was about preventing a dangerous precedent. Harry, however, saw the matter differently. In conversations with trusted friends, he lamented what he perceived as the family's unwillingness to adapt to changing times. Why should the monarchy cling so rigidly to traditions that alienated younger generations? Why couldn't they find a way to balance heritage with personal needs? He pointed to other European royal families who had adapted their property arrangements to suit modern realities, suggesting that Britain's monarchy could benefit from similar flexibility. Outside the palace walls, public opinion on Harry's role in the dispute was divided. His critics saw him as complicit in Meghan's overreach, a willing participant in what they perceived as a challenge to the crown's authority. Supporters, on the other hand, argued that he was simply acting as a husband and father, trying to provide stability and a sense of belonging for his children. This split reflected the larger debate surrounding the Sussexes. Were they rebels with a vision for a modern monarchy, or opportunists undermining the institution for personal gain? In California, The atmosphere within the Sussex household was said to be one of frustration mixed with determination. Meghan reportedly felt that her request was being mischaracterized in the press, and Harry was equally upset by what he saw as a media campaign designed to paint them as grasping and entitled. The couple began discussing ways to take control of the narrative, from carefully planned interviews to potential legal statements. For Harry, these efforts weren't just about the property. They were about defending his family's reputation, which he felt had been unfairly battered since their departure from royal duties. Privately, though, those closest to him wondered if he recognized the full weight of what was at stake. This wasn't a simple family disagreement. This was a public test of the monarchy's resolve under King Charles's leadership. Any sign of compromise could be interpreted as weakness, not just by the British public, but by the global audience that followed royal affairs closely. And because Harry was at the center of it, bound by blood to the man who would decide the outcome, his every move would be magnified. The emotional toll on Harry was evident to those who interacted with him during this period. Longtime friends noticed that his easy smile had been replaced by a more guarded expression. He seemed distracted during social outings, as if his mind was always turning over the same problem. His conversations often circled back to the property, the Queen's memory, and his frustration at what he saw as a lack of understanding from his family. For a man who had already made the monumental decision to step away from royal life, this dispute seemed to reopen wounds he had hoped would begin to heal. Still, Harry held out hope that a solution could be found. One that allowed Meghan and the children to have a meaningful connection to the UK without severing ties completely. Whether that solution would involve the disputed property or a different arrangement altogether was unclear. What was clear, however, was that the king was preparing to make a decision that would leave no room for ambiguity. And when that decision came, Harry would either have to stand with his wife in open defiance or accept a reality he had fought so hard to avoid. For now, he remained in the eye of the storm, pulled in two directions by loyalties that could not be reconciled, waiting for the moment when the quiet tension would break into something far louder. The first headlines appeared almost as whispers in the morning papers, but by midday, the story had exploded into a full-blown media spectacle. What had begun as private discussions inside palace walls was now plastered across newsstands, blaring from television screens, and ricocheting through social media feeds around the globe. The claim that Meghan Markle wanted the late Queen's cherished property for her own family was exactly the sort of story that the press thrived on. It had all the elements of a perfect royal scandal. Family drama, questions of entitlement, the shadow of legacy, and the ever-present undercurrent of unresolved tension between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family. Tabloid editors wasted no time sharpening their narratives. Within hours of the leak, front pages were screaming variations of the same message. Some chose language dripping with outrage, painting Meghan as a woman who had once turned her back on royal life, but now sought to profit from it. Others opted for a subtler sting, framing the request as a tone-deaf move made in the wake of the Queen's passing. Headlines like "Duchess demands the Queen's sanctuary" and "Meghan's bold grab for royal treasure" left little doubt about the stance these papers were taking. Television pundits were equally divided, though few refrained from taking a position. Morning talk shows brought in royal correspondents, etiquette experts, and body language analysts to dissect every possible angle. Was this a calculated move designed to provoke the palace? Or was it, as some argued, a genuine attempt by a mother to secure a connection between her children and their heritage? The debate raged in newsrooms and living rooms alike, with opinion polls beginning to circulate online before the day was out. Social media was perhaps the fiercest battlefield. Hashtags supporting Meghan trended alongside those condemning her, creating a digital tug-of-war that showed no sign of slowing. Supporters pointed out that Archie and Lilibet were great-grandchildren of the late Queen and deserved to have a place in the UK to call their own. Detractors countered that walking away from royal duties meant forfeiting such privileges, especially when it came to property tied so closely to the crown. Memes, think pieces, and viral threads emerged, each one adding fuel to the fire. The international press soon joined in. American outlets framed the story differently, often portraying Meghan and Harry as outsiders battling a rigid institution. Across Europe, the narrative shifted depending on the country. Some leaned towards sympathy for the Sussexes, while others echoed the British media's criticism. Even in Commonwealth nations, where the Queen's memory still carried weight, opinion pieces began to question whether the monarchy's property rules were outdated or necessary to maintain stability. Inside Buckingham Palace, the communications team was caught between two equally unattractive options. One was to ignore the uproar entirely, maintaining the traditional royal silence in the face of controversy. The other was to address the matter publicly, risking an escalation that could turn the dispute into a long-running media feud. For every aide advocating calm and restraint, there was another warning that the story was damaging the monarchy's image with each passing day. King Charles, though not a man given to impulsive reactions, understood the stakes. The longer the narrative was left to spin unchecked, the more entrenched public opinion would become. Yet he also knew that speaking out prematurely could backfire, especially if it appeared that the palace was attacking Meghan outright. In the court of public opinion, perception mattered as much as fact, and this was a battle in which both sides understood the power of optics. What made this particular media storm different from past royal scandals was the emotional resonance of the property in question. The late Queen's legacy was not abstract, it was tangible, and the public had a personal connection to it. Many Britons had grown up seeing images of the Queen at this very estate, whether attending intimate family gatherings or hosting dignitaries in its gardens. To imagine it in the private possession of a couple who had distanced themselves from royal duties was, for some, unthinkable. The coverage capitalized on this sentiment, often showing archival footage of the Queen on the property alongside commentary about its symbolic value. Public backlash came swiftly. Opinion polls commissioned by major news outlets showed a sharp decline in support for Meghan in the UK, with many respondents citing the property dispute as evidence of self-interest. Letters to newspaper editors expressed outrage, with some readers accusing the Duchess of disrespecting the monarchy's traditions. On the streets of London, reporters interviewed passers-by, capturing sound bites that reflected a mixture of disbelief and indignation. "She's not even a working royal anymore. Why should she have it?" one woman said outside a cafe. "It's like wanting to keep a piece of someone else's family home," remarked another. Still, there was no shortage of defenders. Celebrities and public figures sympathetic to Meghan took to their platforms to argue that the backlash was rooted in bias and double standards. They questioned why other members of the royal family could live in lavish residences without similar scrutiny. A few went further, suggesting that the resistance to Meghan's request was driven by deeper, unspoken tensions that had little to do with the property itself. As the media frenzy intensified, the story began to take on a life of its own. Reporters camped outside royal residences, hoping to catch a glimpse of Harry or Meghan on UK soil. Paparazzi trailed them in California, eager for any sign of how they were responding to the controversy. Every public appearance, every social media post, was dissected for hidden meaning. Even the smallest gestures, a hand on a car door, a smile at a charity event, were analyzed as possible indicators of their mood and strategy. The palace, meanwhile, maintained a carefully calculated silence. Behind closed doors, however, the atmosphere was far from calm. Meetings between Charles, his advisors, and senior family members became more frequent, each one focused on how to navigate the growing storm. The challenge was not just to decide what to do about the property, but to ensure that the monarchy's image emerged intact from a scandal that was now global news. For Meghan, the backlash was a bitter reminder of the uphill battle she faced in winning over public opinion in the UK. Friends close to her claimed she was hurt by the way the request had been framed, insisting that her intentions had been misrepresented. Harry, for his part, was said to be growing increasingly frustrated with what he viewed as a one-sided portrayal of the situation. Together, they began to consider ways to take control of the narrative, perhaps through a high-profile interview or a carefully worded statement that would cast their request in a more sympathetic light. But the problem was no longer just about facts, it was about perception. And in a media landscape driven by headlines, sound bites, and viral content, perception could be nearly impossible to change once it hardened. As the backlash reached its peak, the pressure on King Charles to respond grew heavier by the day. The longer the silence, the more room there was for speculation, and speculation was the one thing the monarchy could not afford in a scandal this personal. The media had done what it always does when presented with a royal controversy. It had turned it into a spectacle. But the spectacle was now influencing the very decisions being made behind palace doors. The storm outside was impossible to ignore, and soon, it would push the king to a breaking point where action could no longer be delayed. By the time King Charles decided to step in, the air inside Buckingham Palace was thick with a tension that no amount of gilded grandeur could disguise. The walls, usually accustomed to hosting the quiet hum of royal business, now seemed to echo with a constant undercurrent of whispered conversations and hurried footsteps. Courtiers moved like chess pieces across the boardrooms and private corridors, each one aware that they were operating under the watchful eye of a monarch who was growing increasingly aware that indecision could be as damaging as a misstep. Charles had never been a man who relished confrontation, but he was also no stranger to the necessity of decisive action when the monarchy's stability was at stake. This particular situation carried more weight than the countless PR skirmishes the palace had weathered over the years. The property in question was not just bricks and mortar. It was a living emblem of his mother's reign, a physical manifestation of the Queen's private life and, by extension, the moral authority of the crown itself. To allow it to be claimed by someone who had publicly distanced herself from royal duties was, in his mind, a breach of principle too severe to ignore. The king's first move was to gather the people whose counsel he trusted most. In the privacy of the royal study, a room that had belonged to his mother, now refitted with his own touches, he convened a meeting that included senior advisors, legal experts on royal property, and key members of the family who had a stake in the outcome. Around the table sat figures who had weathered decades of royal controversies, people who knew that this was not just a matter of law, but of optics, precedent, and personal emotion. Charles listened as his advisors laid out the facts. Legally, the property belonged to the crown and could not be transferred to private ownership without significant structural changes to the monarchy's estate management. Even so, the request, whether framed as a formal claim or a personal appeal, had already triggered a wave of public reaction that could not be reversed. Some advisors urged the king to handle the matter quietly, perhaps offering Meghan and Harry the use of a lesser-known property to appease them while avoiding the appearance of outright rejection. Others argued that any concession would be read as weakness, emboldening not only Meghan but any future claimants who might see an opening in the crown's defenses. For Charles, the choice was becoming stark. He could act in a way that preserved family harmony, or he could act in a way that preserved the monarchy's authority. But in this case, the two were in direct conflict. The pressure to uphold his mother's legacy weighed heavily on him. This was not an abstract duty, it was deeply personal. The Queen had poured herself into maintaining the traditions and boundaries that safeguarded the institution. To allow even the perception that those boundaries could be bent for personal convenience would, in his view, be a betrayal. William's voice in the matter was unwavering. In a private conversation with his father before the larger meeting, he made his stance clear. The property was untouchable. He reminded Charles of the countless times the late Queen had spoken about being merely a custodian of such places, never an owner. Allowing Meghan's request, William warned, would send a message that the monarchy's treasures were open to negotiation, a message that could do lasting damage to the crown's credibility. But Charles also knew that his decision would have a direct and profound impact on Harry. The relationship between father and son had already endured deep fractures in recent years, and this would almost certainly make those cracks deeper. Still, the king was prepared to accept that risk. The crown, after all, was larger than any one relationship, even that of father and son. Over the course of several days, Charles held additional meetings, each one peeling back the layers of the situation. Intelligence briefings informed him of the media's relentless framing of the story and the growing public demand for a definitive response. Reports from diplomatic channels indicated that even foreign dignitaries were taking note of the dispute, curious about whether the new monarch would demonstrate resolve or compromise. At the same time, his private secretary brought in historical precedents, cases in which past monarchs had faced similar challenges over royal assets. These precedents were unanimous in their outcome. The property remained with the crown. It was a pattern Charles was not prepared to break. When the time came to make his decision, Charles chose to keep the process controlled and deliberate. He would not rush out a statement in the heat of the moment. Instead, he crafted a plan that began with direct communication to Harry, delivered in person. The meeting between father and son was held in one of the smaller private rooms at Clarence House, away from the grandeur of formal chambers. Those present described the atmosphere as tense but measured. Charles explained that the property was an inseparable part of the crown's heritage and would remain so. He emphasized that this was not a personal attack on Meghan but a matter of principle, one he could not and would not compromise. Harry, according to those familiar with the exchange, listened in silence at first. When he spoke, it was with a mix of frustration and disappointment. He argued that the decision would be seen as yet another example of the family refusing to adapt to changing times. But Charles did not yield. He made it clear that while he valued Harry as his son, the monarchy's stability came first. The conversation ended without raised voices, but with a finality that both men could feel. Behind the scenes, preparations began for what would come next. Charles instructed his communications team to prepare a formal statement, one that would address the matter with the clarity the public was demanding, without fueling unnecessary drama. He also made arrangements to reinforce the property's status as part of the crown's estate, symbolically and administratively, so that no similar claim could arise in the near future. This was the moment when King Charles's reign would take on a more defined shape in the eyes of the public. Up to this point, he had been navigating the delicate transition from heir to sovereign, balancing respect for his mother's legacy with his own vision for the monarchy. Now, faced with a challenge that struck at the heart of both, he was about to show whether he could wield authority with firmness. In the days ahead, the official response would be delivered, and the monarchy's line in the sand would be drawn. For Charles, it would be a declaration not just to Meghan and Harry, but to the nation and the world. The crown's legacy was not up for negotiation, no matter the personal cost. The breaking point did not arrive in a single explosive moment, but built gradually, like a storm gathering on the horizon, each gust of wind and distant rumble signaling that the calm would not last. Inside the palace, there had been weeks of measured conversations, careful positioning, and discreet exchanges between courtiers. But beneath the veneer of diplomacy, tension was tightening like a drawn bowstring, and everyone close to the situation knew that when it finally snapped, the fallout would be impossible to contain. The atmosphere shifted noticeably in the days following King Charles's decision to deny Meghan's claim. While the official statement was still being prepared, the decision itself had already reached Meghan and Harry in private. For Meghan, the refusal was more than a simple denial. It was, according to those in her circle, a personal rejection that cut deeper than she had anticipated. In her view, the property request had not been an act of greed but a heartfelt attempt to honor her children's place in the royal lineage. To be told that it was impossible was, in her mind, an indication that the family would never fully accept her or her children as legitimate participants in the monarchy's future. Harry, meanwhile, found himself struggling to contain his frustration. Friends who spoke to him in the days after the meeting with his father described a man torn between loyalty to his wife and the painful awareness that the decision was final. He had hoped that Charles might find a way to compromise, perhaps granting them long-term access to the property without transferring ownership. But Charles had made it clear that there was no room for half measures. The estate would remain entirely under the crown's custodianship. The tension between the two households, the Sussexes in California and the monarchy in London, began to seep into the public sphere. Meghan's team, aware of the optics, started quietly reaching out to sympathetic journalists, hinting that her side of the story would soon be told. These hints did not go unnoticed by the palace. Senior aides warned the king that any public rebuttal from Meghan could ignite a full-scale media war. Charles, however, was unmoved. He told his advisers that his priority was the integrity of the monarchy, not the temporary turbulence of the news cycle. The first real crack in the fragile calm came when a major international outlet published a detailed account of Meghan's disappointment and frustration, citing unnamed close friends as sources. The article painted her as a woman blindsided by a cold and rigid decision, contrasting her vision of a modernized monarchy with the crown's perceived inflexibility. The piece quickly gained traction, especially among audiences outside the UK who had long viewed Meghan as a figure of independence and resilience. In Britain, however, the story had the opposite effect. The leak was seen by many as a deliberate attempt to pressure the king through public opinion, a tactic that traditionally did not sit well with the monarchy or its supporters. Tabloids framed it as proof that Meghan was trying to undermine the crown, using the press as a weapon. The narrative began to harden into two opposing camps: those who believed the Sussexes were unfairly treated, and those who saw them as relentless in their pursuit of privileges they had forfeited. Behind closed doors, palace insiders described a pivotal meeting in which Charles's advisors urged him to finalize the public statement and release it sooner than planned. They argued that the longer the Sussexes controlled the narrative, the harder it would be for the crown to reclaim it. The king listened, then agreed. The statement would be issued within days, and it would make clear, without naming Meghan directly, that the crown's properties were not subject to personal claims by any individual, regardless of status. But even before the statement was released, the personal dimension of the conflict reached a new intensity. There were reports of a heated phone call between Harry and William, during which William accused Harry of orchestrating the leaks to the press. Harry, in turn, reportedly accused his brother of being unwilling to see beyond tradition, of prioritizing rules over family bonds. The call ended abruptly, with neither side willing to yield. For Charles, the moment of release, the true breaking point, came when it became clear that silence was no longer an option. On a crisp morning, the palace issued the long-awaited statement. Its language was formal, measured, and unambiguous. It reiterated the crown's duty to preserve certain properties for the benefit of the institution and the nation, underscored that these properties could not be allocated for private ownership, and closed with a reminder of the monarch's role as custodian of history. There was no mention of Meghan or Harry, but the subtext was unmistakable. The reaction was immediate. Supporters of the monarchy praised Charles for standing firm, calling it a decisive move that reinforced the boundaries of royal privilege. Critics accused the palace of hiding behind tradition to exclude Meghan and her children from the inner circle. The media treated the statement as both a confirmation of the rumors and a bold declaration of royal authority. For Meghan, the public nature of the refusal was deeply stinging. Sources close to her claimed she felt humiliated, not just by the denial, but by the way it had been framed as a matter of principle rather than personal consideration. Within hours of the statement, talk began to circulate about a possible televised interview in which she could tell her side of the story. The palace braced itself for impact. Courtiers knew that this was no longer a quiet family dispute. It was a public battle of narratives, and each side was preparing its next move. The king had drawn his line, but the Sussexes had yet to decide how they would respond. The calm after the statement was not real calm at all. It was the eye of the storm, and everyone knew the winds would pick up again soon. The official royal statement was drafted over several tense days, with every word weighed for both its legal precision and its public impact. Inside Buckingham Palace, the team responsible for communications understood that this was not merely a press release. It was a line in the sand, a moment that would define King Charles's approach to leadership. The statement had to accomplish multiple goals at once. It needed to reaffirm the crown's position without appearing vindictive, address the growing public speculation without directly naming Meghan or Harry, and close the door on the property dispute in a way that could not be reopened. The drafting process was meticulous. The king's private secretary oversaw the language, working closely with the palace's legal counsel and senior aides who understood the traditions surrounding royal estates. Historical precedent was consulted to ensure the statement would align with centuries of established protocol. Examples of past declarations from previous monarchs were reviewed, times when disputes over royal property or titles had required a firm but carefully worded response. The team knew they had to avoid emotional language, yet they also had to communicate an unshakable authority that would leave no doubt about the outcome. Charles himself was deeply involved, reading and revising several drafts. Those present during the process recalled his insistence that the tone be calm but resolute. He wanted the language to reflect his role as custodian of the monarchy, not as a father engaged in a family quarrel. His goal was to make clear that the decision was not personal. even though everyone involved knew the roots of the matter were steeped in personal relationships and long-standing tensions. The final version of the statement was set to be released at exactly 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the time chosen deliberately to dominate the news cycle for the day. It was short by design, less than 400 words, but every sentence was crafted to serve a purpose. The opening line acknowledged the enduring importance of the crown's heritage, noting that certain properties carried both historical and symbolic value that bound them inseparably to the monarchy's service. The next section reaffirmed the legal framework that governed these properties, emphasizing that they could not be allocated for private use or ownership outside the duties of the reigning monarch and those directly engaged in service to the crown. Without mentioning Meghan or Harry, the statement referred to recent public discussions and expressed gratitude for the public's interest in preserving the monarchy's traditions. It then firmly stated that the estate in question would remain under the direct custodianship of the crown, in keeping with the long-standing principle that such properties are held in trust for the nation and its history. The closing line underscored the monarch's duty to protect this heritage for future generations, ending on a note of solemn commitment rather than confrontation. When the statement was released, it was accompanied by an official photograph of King Charles taken in one of the staterooms, seated at a desk with the royal seal visible in the frame. The image was purposeful. It reinforced the authority of the message and projected a sense of stability and control. Palace staff were instructed not to elaborate on the statement in media interviews, and all inquiries were met with the same response. The statement speaks for itself. The public reaction was swift and divided. Supporters of the monarchy praised the clarity and firmness of the king's words, seeing them as a necessary defense of tradition. They appreciated that the statement avoided inflammatory language and refused to engage in personal attacks. For them, this was a dignified assertion of the crown's authority and a sign that Charles was prepared to lead with strength when tested. Critics, however, saw the statement differently. Some argued that its formality masked a lack of compassion, that it ignored the personal realities of the people involved, particularly the Sussex children, who were, after all, direct descendants of the Queen. Others accused the king of hiding behind legal and historical precedent to justify what they perceived as an exclusionary decision. Among Meghan's supporters, the lack of her name in the statement was interpreted not as a sign of respect, but as a way of avoiding accountability for what they saw as a personal slight. Internationally, the statement was dissected by royal commentators and political analysts. In the United States, coverage tended to frame it as the monarchy defending its territory against a younger, modern couple who represented change. In Europe and the Commonwealth nations, the tone varied. Some outlets echoed the British press in supporting the king's firm stance, while others questioned whether this rigid adherence to tradition might alienate future generations. Inside the Sussex household, the release of the statement was met with quiet but intense discussion. Friends close to Meghan reported that she was hurt by the public confirmation of the denial, feeling that it painted her into a corner without giving her the chance to share her perspective. Harry, though more resigned to the outcome, was said to be concerned about the long-term impact on his children's connection to the UK. The couple began discussing how, and when, they might respond publicly, knowing that remaining silent could allow the palace's version of events to solidify in the public consciousness. For Charles, the statement achieved its immediate purpose. It stopped the speculation from spiraling further and reasserted control over the narrative. Yet even he understood that the decision and the way it had been communicated would reverberate for months, perhaps years, to come. The property dispute had crossed from the realm of private family matters into the broader stage of public history, and no statement, however carefully worded, could erase the emotions that had been stirred on both sides. The release marked the official close of the dispute in the eyes of the monarchy, but it was far from the end of the story. Outside the palace gates, the conversation continued, louder than ever. And inside, those closest to the king knew that the real challenge now would be managing what came next, because Meghan was not known for letting such matters rest without having her say. Meghan's countermove was not made in haste. She had learned, through experience and necessity, that reacting impulsively to royal statements almost always played into the palace's advantage. Instead, She allowed the weight of King Charles's announcement to hang in the air for a few days, letting public reaction swirl, settle, and split into its inevitable camps. But beneath the calm surface, she and her team were working deliberately, preparing a response that would be both emotionally charged and strategically calculated. In Montecito, the Sussexes' home became the center of quiet but intense activity. Meghan's closest advisors, PR specialists, legal counsel, and a handful of trusted friends gathered to review the royal statement word by word. On the surface, the statement had avoided direct accusation, but Meghan saw the subtext. To her, the absence of her name was not an act of courtesy, but an intentional framing that placed the palace in a position of moral authority while leaving her on the defensive. The statement's emphasis on heritage and custodianship, she believed, subtly painted her as someone who had sought to undermine a national treasure. Her first instinct was to address the matter through a written statement of her own, one that would clarify her intentions and counter the portrayal of her claim as self-serving. But some in her circle advised a more personal touch. The British press had already dissected her every word for years. Perhaps the most effective response would be her own voice and image, an interview where she could speak directly to the audience, bypassing the palace's formal tone. This idea took root quickly. Meghan began reaching out to high-profile media contacts, considering offers from both American and international outlets. The choice of platform was critical. A UK-based interview risked being overshadowed by the same media establishment she believed had been hostile to her from the start. An American platform, on the other hand, would give her more control over the narrative while still reaching a global audience. One name kept surfacing in these discussions: a veteran talk show host known for eliciting emotional, unguarded responses from guests and for generating massive viewership. While negotiations for a potential interview began quietly in the background, Meghan also worked on shaping the message she wanted to deliver. Central to her strategy was reframing the property dispute as an issue of family connection rather than ownership. She planned to emphasize that her request had been motivated by the desire for her children to have a meaningful link to their heritage. A place where they could learn about their great-grandmother, the late Queen, and feel that they had a tangible connection to the United Kingdom. This was not, she would insist, about taking something away from the crown, but about ensuring that the next generation remained tied to it in a personal, human way. At the same time, Meghan's legal team prepared a more formal response, aimed not at the public, but at the palace itself. This document, carefully worded and devoid of emotion, reiterated her position in factual terms and requested a review of how the decision had been reached. It was unlikely to change the outcome, but it served an important purpose. It put her objections on record in a way that could be referenced later should the dispute escalate. Then came the calculated leaks. Sympathetic journalists began publishing pieces that, while not quoting Meghan directly, clearly reflected her perspective. These articles painted the picture of a woman who had approached the palace respectfully, who had been blindsided by the firmness of the refusal, and who now found herself once again painted as an antagonist in a family drama she never sought to inflame. The leaks were subtle enough to avoid accusations of an outright media offensive, but direct enough to shift parts of the conversation in her favor. The public response to these leaks was predictably polarized. Supporters praised her for taking the high road, for not attacking the king personally despite what they viewed as an unfair decision. Critics dismissed the stories as manipulative, accusing her of orchestrating a sympathy campaign. Yet both camps were now talking about her perspective, and that, in itself, was a victory in the war of narratives. Behind the scenes, Harry played a quieter but no less significant role. His primary focus was on ensuring that whatever Meghan said publicly would not burn the last remaining bridges between him and his father. He urged her to keep the message centered on the children, to avoid language that could be interpreted as questioning the king's legitimacy or authority. Whether out of strategic sense or genuine personal restraint, Meghan agreed. The turning point in her countermove came when the interview was confirmed. The filming date was set for just over a week after the royal statement, giving her enough time to prepare while ensuring the topic remained fresh in the news cycle. She worked closely with the production team to create an environment where she could appear open and vulnerable without losing control of the conversation. Lighting, setting, Even the arrangement of flowers on the table. Every detail was discussed to create the right balance between intimacy and gravitas. In the days leading up to the interview, the media speculation was relentless. Some predicted a bombshell expose that would rival her previous tell-all conversations. Others expected a softer approach, focusing more on her hopes for the future than on grievances from the past. Whatever they imagined, one thing was certain: the world would be watching. When the interview finally aired, Meghan did not shy away from the topic of the property. She described her vision for it, not as a personal estate, but as a shared family space that could also be used for charitable initiatives connected to causes the Queen had championed. She spoke warmly of the Queen, recalling personal moments and emphasizing the deep respect she had for her life and service. But she also expressed sadness that her children might never experience that same connection in a meaningful, personal way. Her tone was measured, her words carefully chosen, but the underlying message was clear. She believed the decision had been made without considering the full human impact. While she stopped short of accusing the palace of malice, she questioned whether tradition should outweigh the needs of living family members, particularly children who were part of the monarchy's story, whether the institution acknowledged it or not. The interview reignited the debate with renewed force. Supporters hailed her as dignified and thoughtful. Critics saw the performance as calculated and self-serving. For the palace, the challenge was clear. Meghan's countermove had shifted the conversation again, ensuring that her perspective would remain part of the public record. And yet, for all the planning and strategy that went into her response, one truth remained: the king's decision stood firm. The property was not hers to claim, and no amount of public sympathy could change that. But in the court of public opinion, Meghan had ensured that she was not silent, and in doing so, she kept the story alive in a way that meant the palace would have to continue managing its aftermath.